There is a particular kind of cruelty that doesn't arrive with fists or raised voices. It arrives in a tailored coat, carrying a glass of champagne, smiling at everyone in the room except the one person who gave up everything to stand beside him. Duke Nathaniel Blackmore was that kind of cruel, the kind that left no bruises anyone could see and no evidence anyone could present before a magistrate. The kind that made a woman question whether the ground beneath her feet was real. And on the night of his own wedding banquet, surrounded by 400 of the kingdom's most powerful souls, he proved exactly how dangerous a man becomes when he mistakes his own emptiness for strength. What happened next in that ballroom changed everything. Stay with this story to the very end, because nothing here is what it appears to be. The morning Vivian Ashford left her father's estate, she wore a pale gray traveling dress and carried a single leather trunk that held everything she'd chosen to bring into her new life. Not everything she owned, everything she'd chosen. There was a difference, and the distinction mattered to her more than she would ever say aloud. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, stood on the gravel drive with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set in the particular way it always set when he was performing composure rather than feeling it. He had negotiated this marriage over 7 months of correspondence, 3 in-person meetings, and 1 deeply uncomfortable dinner with the Blackmore family's chief steward. The terms were favorable. The Ashford debts, not catastrophic, but persistent enough to erode the family's standing over another generation, would be absorbed into the Blackmore fortune like rain into dark soil. In exchange, Nathaniel Blackmore would receive a wife whose bloodline carried enough political weight to silence the whispers that had followed his family since his father's financial scandals. "You understand what you're walking into," Edmund said. Not a question. Vivian adjusted her gloves. "I understand what I'm walking away from. That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it's not." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. She had her mother's face, the sharp cheekbones, the calm gray eyes that revealed nothing unless she wanted them to. Her mother had died when Vivian was 11, and in the 15 years since, he had watched his daughter develop the same unsettling ability to hold an entire room's attention simply by refusing to compete for it. "The Blackmore estate is 3 times the size of ours," he said, filling the silence with facts because facts were easier than feelings. "His income from the Northern Territories alone exceeds our total annual revenue. You'll want for nothing." "I've never wanted for nothing, Father. I've wanted for very specific things." He didn't ask what those things were. He already knew the answer would make him feel worse than he already did. Instead, he kissed her forehead, a gesture so rare from him that it almost made her cry, and watched the carriage pull away down the oak-lined drive. The journey to Blackmore Hall took 2 full days. Vivian spent most of it reading and watching the landscape shift from the gentle rolling hills of Ashford country into something darker, harder. The Northern Territories carried a different weight in their soil. The trees grew taller but seemed less alive, their branches reaching upward like hands grasping for something just out of reach. The villages grew smaller and more spread apart. The people she glimpsed through the carriage window moved with the hunched efficiency of those who had learned not to waste energy on anything that didn't directly contribute to survival. She arrived at Blackmore Hall in the late afternoon of the second day, when the sun hung low enough to turn the massive stone facade the color of old blood. The estate was enormous. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the silence. A property this size should have hummed with activity. Groundskeepers, servants, stable hands, visitors. Instead, the courtyard stood empty except for a single footman who took her trunk without meeting her eyes, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Calloway who greeted her with the rehearsed warmth of someone following instructions. "The Duke sends his regrets," Mrs. Calloway said, leading Vivian through the entrance hall. "He's been detained on estate business and will join you for dinner." "Of course," Vivian said. She was shown to her chambers, a suite of rooms on the east wing that were beautifully appointed and entirely impersonal. Fresh flowers on the writing desk, new linens on the bed. A wardrobe stocked with dresses she hadn't chosen, in colors that suited her complexion but not her taste. Someone had done their research. Someone had prepared for her arrival the way one might prepare a guest room at an inn, competently, thoroughly, and without any real investment in whether the guest actually enjoyed their stay. Vivian stood at the window and looked out over the gardens. They were immaculate. Geometrically precise hedgerows, gravel paths raked into patterns, not a single weed visible anywhere. She thought about the wildflower meadow behind her father's house, where nothing grew in straight lines and everything fought for its own patch of sunlight, and she felt the first cold thread of understanding wind through her chest. This was a house that valued control above all else, and she had just married the man who controlled it. Nathaniel Blackmore arrived for dinner 40 minutes late. Vivian had been seated at one end of a dining table long enough to seat 20, with 8 candelabras burning between them and enough silverware for a state dinner. She had changed into one of the dresses from the wardrobe, a deep navy that she had to admit was well chosen, and she had spent the waiting time studying the portraits on the dining room walls. Blackmore men going back 5 generations, all painted with the same expression, jaws set, eyes forward, mouths that looked like they had never formed the shape of a question. When Nathaniel finally entered, she understood the portraits perfectly. He was tall, taller than she had remembered from their 2 brief meetings during the engagement negotiations. Broad through the shoulders in a way that his tailored black coat couldn't entirely civilize. Dark hair pushed back from a face that would have been handsome if it had contained any warmth at all. His eyes were the deep blue of a lake in winter, beautiful from a distance, fatal to anyone who fell in. "Lady Ashford," he said, taking his seat at the opposite end of the table without apology or explanation for his lateness. He didn't use her new title. Whether that was deliberate or careless, she couldn't tell yet. Both options said something. "Your Grace," she replied. A servant poured wine. Another placed the first course. The sounds of silver on porcelain filled the space between them like a third presence at the table. "Your journey was acceptable?" Nathaniel asked, cutting into his food without looking up. "It was long. The distance is the point. My father chose this location specifically because it discourages casual visitors." "Your father sounds like a man who valued his privacy." Nathaniel's knife paused for half a second. "My father valued many things. Privacy was simply the one that cost the least." Vivian filed that away. The slight tension around his mouth when he spoke of his father, the way his grip tightened on the knife handle, a wound there, still tender. She didn't press it. Not because she was afraid to, but because pressing wounds in a man she didn't yet understand was a strategy she couldn't afford. "Mrs. Calloway has been very accommodating," she said instead. "The rooms are lovely." "They should be. They cost enough." She took a sip of wine and let the comment pass through her like water through a net. "I noticed the east garden from my window. The hedgerows are remarkable." "They're hedgerows." "They're a statement," she said quietly. "Everything trimmed to the same height. Every branch directed. Nothing allowed to grow where it isn't planned." Nathaniel looked up at her for the first time since sitting down. His eyes moved across her face with the assessing quality of a man evaluating a purchase he wasn't sure he'd needed to make. "You read a great deal into landscaping." "I read a great deal into everything. It's the only advantage available to someone in my position." Something shifted in his expression, not softening, exactly, but a flicker of recognition, like a predator noting that its presumed prey had claws. It lasted less than a second before the mask settled back into place. "You should know," he said, returning to his plate, "that I agreed to this marriage for practical reasons. I assume you did the same." "I did." "Good. Then we understand each other." "We understand the terms," Vivian said. "Understanding each other will take considerably longer." He didn't respond to that. They finished dinner in silence, and when Nathaniel rose from the table, he left without saying goodnight. Vivian sat alone in the candlelight for a long time after he was gone. She thought about the way his voice had flattened when he'd said practical reasons, as though the words themselves bored him. She thought about the empty courtyard and the silent hallways and the precisely trimmed hedgerows. And she thought about the fact that not once during the entire meal had he used her first name. She wasn't naive. She hadn't expected love. She hadn't even expected warmth. But she had expected the basic decency of acknowledgement, the willingness to look at the person sitting across from you and recognize that they were, in fact, a person. Nathaniel Blackmore hadn't given her even that much. The weeks that followed established a pattern that Vivian learned to navigate the way a sailor learns to read currents. Not because the water was friendly, but because drowning wasn't an option. Nathaniel was absent more than he was present. He rode out early each morning to oversee estate operations and returned late, taking his dinner in his study more often than not. On the rare occasions they occupied the same room, his conversation was clipped, functional, and devoid of anything that might be mistaken for personal interest. He asked about household matters the way a landlord might ask a tenant about plumbing, with the expectation that problems would be reported and solutions would not require his emotional involvement. Vivian adapted. She explored the estate methodically, learning its rhythms, meeting its staff, cataloging its strengths and its neglect. The main house was maintained to an exacting standard, but the outlying tenant farms told a different story. Roofs that needed repair, fences that hadn't been mended in years, children who looked underfed. She mentioned this to Nathaniel one evening when he happened to pass through the drawing room where she was working on correspondence. The Henderson farm on the western boundary needs a new roof before winter, she said, and the Miller family's youngest has been ill for weeks without anyone summoning a physician. Nathaniel paused in the doorway. The steward handles tenant affairs. The steward hasn't visited the western tenant since April. I checked. His jaw tightened. And you're telling me this because they're your tenants. Their welfare is your responsibility. Their welfare is a line item in an operating budget. Their welfare is a 3-year-old girl who can't stop coughing. The silence that followed was the loudest sound the house had produced since her arrival. Nathaniel stared at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Irritation, certainly, but underneath it something else. Something that looked almost like surprise, as though he hadn't anticipated that the woman he'd acquired through negotiation would have the nerve to challenge him in his own house. I'll speak to the steward, he said finally, and left. He did speak to the steward. The roof was repaired within a week, and a physician visited the Miller family the following day. Nathaniel never mentioned it again, and Vivian understood that this was how the game would be played. She would identify problems, present them without emotion, and wait for him to act while pretending the action had been his idea all along. It was exhausting, it was demeaning, and it worked. She hated that it worked. The invitation to the Royal Victory banquet arrived 6 weeks after the wedding. Vivian found it on the breakfast table, a heavy cream envelope bearing the royal seal, addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the paper and everything it represented. His Majesty is celebrating the Northern Campaign's conclusion, Mrs. Calloway explained, pouring tea. Every noble house of standing has been invited. It will be the event of the season. And the first time the court sees the new Duchess of Blackmore, Vivian said. Yes, my lady. Vivian set the invitation down. She had been prepared for this moment. The public debut, the performance, the carefully choreographed display of a functional marriage. She had watched her mother do it for years. You wore the right dress, you smiled at the right people, you stood beside your husband and radiated the precise combination of devotion and independence that society demanded of a woman in her position. She could do it. She had been trained for it her entire life. What she hadn't been trained for was doing it beside a man who couldn't be bothered to look at her. Nathaniel's reaction to the invitation was unexpected. For the first time since the wedding, he sought her out. He found her in the library that afternoon and stood in the doorway with the kind of deliberate posture that suggested he'd been thinking about what to say. The banquet, he began. I saw the invitation. There will be expectations. There are always expectations. He crossed his arms. I mean specific expectations. About us. About how we appear. You mean you need me to pretend we have a functioning marriage? The directness landed like a slap. He absorbed it without flinching. She'd give him that much credit. I need us to present a unified front, he said carefully. The Blackmore name carries weight. I won't have it undermined by whispers. Then perhaps you should have considered that before spending 6 weeks treating me like furniture. Another silence. This one had teeth. I'll have a dressmaker sent from the capital, he said, ignoring her comment entirely. Whatever you need for the evening, spare no expense. He left before she could respond. The dressmaker arrived 3 days later, a tiny, sharp-eyed woman named Delphine, who took Vivian's measurements with the precision of an architect and the commentary of a general planning a siege. The court will be watching you, Delphine said through a mouthful of pins. Every hem, every neckline, every choice you make about your appearance will be read as a statement about your marriage, your politics, and your ambition. What do you want to say? Vivian considered. That I belong there. No, Delphine said. You already belong there. Your bloodline guarantees that. What do you want them to know? Vivian looked at herself in the mirror. The sharp cheekbones, the calm gray eyes, the straight spine she'd inherited from a long line of women who had survived by standing upright when everyone around them was buckling. That I'm not afraid, Delphine smiled for the first time. Now that I can dress. The night of the banquet, Vivian descended the main staircase of Blackmore Hall, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light like dark water. Her hair was pulled back from her face in a style that was elegant without being soft. No curls, no ornamentation, nothing that suggested she was trying to please anyone. A single strand of pearls at her throat. Her mother's earrings. Nothing else. Nathaniel waited at the bottom of the stairs in full formal attire. Black coat, white shirt, the Blackmore family crest pinned at his chest. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and for one unguarded moment, his expression cracked open. Not warmth, not admiration. Something rawer, something that looked like the sudden, unwelcome recognition that the woman he had been ignoring was not the woman he had assumed she was. The moment passed. His face closed. "The carriage is waiting," he said. The grand ballroom of the royal palace was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of small carriages hung from a ceiling painted with scenes of military triumph. Gold leaf covered every surface that would hold it. The floor was white marble, polished to such a shine that the guests appeared to walk on their own reflections, doubled and inverted beneath their feet. 400 people, the most powerful names in the kingdom, military commanders in dress uniforms heavy with medals, politicians in dark coats, their smiles calibrated to convey exactly the right mixture of deference and ambition, their wives in silk and jewels, each one a walking statement about her family's wealth and taste. Servants moved between them like ghosts, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne and delicacies that most of the kingdom's citizens would never taste. Vivian entered on Nathaniel's arm, and the room noticed. She felt it. The subtle shift in attention, the way conversations paused and eyes turned. Not because she was beautiful, although she was, not because she was new, although that helped, but because the court had been waiting for this moment. The marriage of Nathaniel Blackmore had been the subject of speculation for months, and the woman he'd chosen, or rather, the woman his financial situation had chosen for him, was finally here to be assessed. She kept her spine straight and her expression calm. Beside her, Nathaniel moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing at these events his entire life. He shook hands. He exchanged pleasantries. He introduced Vivian to a succession of lords and ladies whose names she memorized instantly because forgetting a name in this environment was a political mistake she couldn't afford. "Duchess Blackmore," said Lord Harrington, a stout man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for knowing every secret in the kingdom before the people keeping them did. "A pleasure to finally meet you. Your father and I go back many years." "Lord Harrington, he speaks of you often." "Does he speak of his debts as often?" Harrington asked with the cheerful brutality of a man who had never needed to be polite. Beside her, Nathaniel stiffened. Vivian didn't. "My father speaks of his obligations with the seriousness they deserve," she said. "Much like I imagine you speak of your third wife's spending habits." Harrington stared at her for 2 full seconds, then burst out laughing. "Oh, Blackmore," he said, clapping Nathaniel on the shoulder. "You've married one with teeth. Good luck with that." They moved on. Nathaniel said nothing about the exchange, but Vivian caught him glancing at her with that same unsettled expression, the crack in the mask that appeared whenever she did something he hadn't predicted. The evening proceeded through its choreographed phases. Dinner at long tables arranged by rank, toast to the king, toast to the military, toast to alliances and prosperity, and all the abstract concepts that powerful people invoke when they want to feel noble about their privilege. Vivian ate little, drank less, and listened to everything. It was during the dancing that the temperature changed. Nathaniel had not asked her to dance. This was noted. In a room full of people who communicated through gesture and omission as much as through speech, the failure of a newly married duke to dance with his duchess was a sentence written in ink. Vivian stood near the eastern windows, watching the couples move across the floor in patterns as rigid and predictable as the hedgerows at Blackmore Hall. She was composing her face into pleasant neutrality when she noticed Nathaniel across the room, speaking with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was striking. Auburn hair, a figure that her cream-colored gown did nothing to conceal, and a laugh that carried across the ballroom like music designed for a specific audience of one. She touched Nathaniel's arm when she spoke. He didn't pull away. And the expression on his face, the expression Vivian had never seen directed at her, was one of unguarded, almost desperate attention. "Lady Eleonora Voss," said a quiet voice beside her. Vivian turned. A tall man in a dark blue military dress coat stood nearby, following her gaze with an expression of careful sympathy. He was perhaps 30, with angular features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while giving away nothing. "I beg your pardon?" "The woman your husband is currently making a spectacle with, Lady Eleonora Voss. They were involved before your engagement was announced." Vivian looked back at Nathaniel and Eleonora, the way he leaned toward her, the way his hand hovered at the small of her back without quite touching, the way every line of his body was oriented toward her like a compass needle finding north. "Involved," Vivian repeated, deeply and not quietly. Their arrangement ended when the Blackmore finances made a strategic marriage necessary. The man paused. "I apologize. I should have introduced myself before delivering unpleasant information. Prince Adrian Ravenshire." A prince, standing beside her at a party, watching her husband court another woman, and having the decency to name the humiliation rather than pretend it wasn't happening. "Your Highness," Vivian said, and managed something that was almost a smile. "You have a talent for honesty that must make you very unpopular at court." "Spectacularly so." He didn't smile back, but his eyes warmed slightly. "For what it's worth, Duchess, every person in this room has noticed what's happening, and most of them are on your side." "I wasn't aware I needed sides." "You didn't, until about 30 seconds ago." He excused himself with a slight bow, and Vivian stood alone again, watching her husband and the woman he actually wanted, feeling the curious sensation of watching her own humiliation from outside her body, as though she were both the person it was happening to and the audience witnessing it. She could leave. She could cross the room and interrupt. She could pretend she hadn't noticed. Every option carried a cost, and she was calculating them with the cold efficiency of a woman whose survival instincts had been sharpened by a lifetime of watching, listening, and waiting. She chose to wait. That was her mistake. Because what came next wasn't the quiet cruelty of neglect. It was something far worse. The orchestra paused between sets. The ballroom dimmed its energy for a moment, conversations settling into the lull that precedes the next act of any performance. It was in this lull, this brief window of collective attention, that Lord Harrington raised his glass and called out across the room. "A toast, if I may, to the newlyweds, Duke and Duchess Blackmore. May your union be as profitable as it was strategic." Laughter. The comfortable, knowing laughter of people who understood that all marriages at this level were transactions and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Nathaniel raised his glass. Vivian saw it from across the room, the way his jaw was set, the way his eyes carried the particular glaze of a man who had been drinking steadily and thinking dangerously for the past 2 hours. Eleonora stood close behind him, and whether it was her presence, or his own accumulated resentment, or simply the cruelty that lived in him like a second heartbeat, what came out of his mouth next was the sound of a man choosing to destroy something because he could. "To my wife," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "A woman of impeccable breeding and considerable political utility. My advisors assure me I made an excellent investment." The silence that followed was absolute. 400 people held their breath. He wasn't finished. "Though I confess," he continued, swirling his champagne with the casual indifference of a man discussing livestock, "I sometimes struggle to remember whether I acquired a duchess or a line item in a ledger. Fortunately, Mrs. Calloway assures me she's been performing her domestic functions adequately, which is, after all, the terms of the arrangement." Vivian stood completely still. The blood left her face so quickly that for a moment the room tilted sideways, and she had to press her fingernails into her palms hard enough to draw crescent-shaped marks in the skin just to stay upright. Around her she could feel the reactions rippling outward, the sharp intake of breath from the woman to her left, the whispered exchange between two lords behind her, the pitying glance from a servant carrying a tray of empty glasses. This was it. This was the moment every person in this room would remember when they thought of her. Not her dress, not her wit with Lord Harrington, not her composure or her bloodline or her careful, precise dignity, They would remember her standing alone in a ballroom while her husband described her as a purchase. She looked across the room and found Nathaniel's eyes. He was watching her, waiting. And behind the champagne and the bravado and the desperate need to prove to Eleanor Voss that his marriage meant nothing, she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. He was afraid. Not of her, not of the room, of himself, of the part of him that had just spoken those words and meant them and didn't mean them simultaneously. The part that destroyed things not because he wanted them destroyed, but because the alternative was admitting he didn't know how to build them. It didn't matter. Understanding the wound doesn't heal the knife cut. Vivian held his gaze for 5 full seconds. She didn't blink. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She let him see exactly what he had done, not with anger, not with devastation, but with the clear, quiet recognition of a woman who had just learned everything she needed to know about the man she had married. Then she set down her untouched glass of champagne on the nearest table, straightened the front of her emerald gown, and walked through 400 staring nobles toward the ballroom doors. Her heels struck the marble floor with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. She walked the way her mother had taught her to walk, as though the ground existed for the purpose of holding her up. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The ballroom remained suspended in the terrible electric silence of people who had just witnessed something they would be talking about for years. The footman at the door opened it without being asked. Vivian stepped through into the corridor beyond, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a sentence ending. In the carriage on the way back to Blackmore Hall, she sat in the darkness and pressed both hands flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. The tremor started in her fingers and worked its way inward until her whole body was vibrating with the effort of containment, the physical cost of refusing to collapse when every nerve in her body was screaming for release. She didn't cry. Crying was a release valve, and she couldn't afford to release anything right now. If she started, she would have to feel everything she had been refusing to feel since the moment she stepped into this marriage. The loneliness, the diminishment, the slow erosion of selfhood that comes from being treated as an object by someone who is supposed to be your partner. She would have to feel the specific, targeted devastation of being publicly reduced to a transaction by a man who had never bothered to discover that she was anything more. So instead, she pressed her hands flat and breathed and stared into the darkness and made herself a single silent promise. She would not beg. She would not perform. She would not twist herself into whatever shape Nathaniel Blackmore needed her to be in order to earn the basic respect she had deserved from the first moment she walked through his door. She would survive this. Not by fighting, not by leaving, not yet, but by becoming something he hadn't anticipated, something the entire court hadn't anticipated. The carriage wheels turned beneath her, carrying her back to a house that wasn't a home, beside a life that wasn't a life, toward a future she would have to build entirely by herself. She was 26 years old. She was the Duchess of Blackmore, and as of tonight, she was completely, irreversibly alone. Back at the banquet, Nathaniel Blackmore stood in the center of 400 people and discovered what it felt like when a room that had been laughing with you began looking through you. The champagne in his hand had gone warm. Eleanor had stepped away, not dramatically, not with any gesture that could be read as criticism, but with the quiet, instinctive retreat of a woman who recognized that she was standing too close to something that was about to collapse. Lord Harrington passed by without making eye contact. The Duchess of Whitmore turned her back mid-conversation. And across the ballroom, Prince Adrian Ravenshire stood watching him with an expression that Nathaniel would spend weeks trying to decipher. Not anger, not judgment, but something far worse. Pity. The prince pitied him. A man of royal blood, a man whose opinion shaped the social landscape of the entire kingdom, looked at Nathaniel Blackmore and saw someone deserving not of respect or fear or even contempt, but of the small, corrosive mercy reserved for those who have just destroyed the best thing they will ever have. Nathaniel set his glass down. His hand was steady. His face was composed. And inside his chest, in the space where something vital should have been beating, there was a silence louder than anything the ballroom had ever contained. He told himself it didn't matter. She was a political arrangement, a solution to a financial problem. He had married her name and her family's connections, not her. But the image wouldn't leave. Vivian's face in that final moment, gray eyes locked on his, holding nothing back and asking for nothing. The absolute devastating absence of surprise, as though she had been waiting for this, as though some part of her had known from the first night at that endless dining table that this was exactly the kind of man she had married. That was the part that stuck. Not her pain, her lack of surprise, as if she had already calculated the cost of him and found the total unremarkable. The ballroom resumed its rhythms, the orchestra played, the champagne flowed. But something had shifted in the room's architecture. An invisible redistribution of weight, a recalibration of allegiance that Nathaniel could feel but not yet name. 3 hours later, when the last carriage pulled away from the palace and the servants began extinguishing the chandeliers one by one, a sealed letter was delivered to the private study of Prince Adrian Ravenshire. It contained 3 sentences in a handwriting the prince did not recognize, written on paper that carried the faint scent of emerald silk and a woman's quiet, furious determination. The letter read, "Your Highness, you told me I would need sides. I didn't believe you then. I believe you now." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Adrian Ravenshire read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, closest to his chest. And in the silence of the palace, where power shifted like smoke and loyalty was the most dangerous currency of all, something began that no one in the kingdom, not the court, not the duke, and not even Vivian herself, could have predicted. The letter left Prince Adrian Ravenshire's hands exactly once in the 3 days following the banquet. He read it again the morning after receiving it, standing at the window of his private study with the pale winter light coming in flat and cold across the city below. 3 sentences. No signature. The handwriting was controlled. Not the careful, practiced script of a woman who had been trained to produce beautiful letters, but the tighter, more contained hand of someone who had written it fast, under pressure, in the back of a carriage with her hand still shaking. He knew the difference. He had received enough desperate correspondence in his life to recognize the physical signature of controlled fury on paper. He folded it back along its original creases and returned it to his coat pocket, and he did not contact Vivian Blackmore for exactly 11 days. Not out of indifference, out of a respect so precise it had edges. She needed to be left alone with what had happened. She needed to be allowed to feel the full weight of it without anyone, however well-intentioned, turning her humiliation into a conversation about themselves. He had learned this from watching powerful people in crisis his entire life. The ones who survived weren't the ones who were caught fastest. They were the ones who were given enough space to figure out what kind of person they were going to become next. He waited, and he watched from the distance that rank and circumstance permitted. What he saw over those 11 days was not what he expected. He had expected the usual pattern, the strategic retreat, the quiet withdrawal from public life while the whispers did their work, and the humiliated party spent weeks reconstructing their social armor behind closed doors. He had expected Vivian Blackmore to disappear for a while, to let the scandal metabolize, to reemerge when the court had moved on to something else. Instead, on the 3rd day after the banquet, she attended a charity organization meeting at the home of Countess Marlowe. On the 5th day, she visited the public hospital on the city's eastern edge and spent 4 hours there, talking to physicians and taking notes in a small leather book she carried in her coat pocket. On the 8th day, she arranged a meeting with the kingdom's primary agricultural administrator and requested access to estate yield records from the Northern Territories, the records that showed which tenant populations were operating below subsistence level. The administrator, a cautious man named Fowler, who had spent 20 years carefully not offending anyone powerful, initially refused. He cited procedural requirements. She cited the Duchess of Blackmore's legal standing as co-holder of the Blackmore estate and her formal right to access any record pertaining to its governance. Fowler, who had clearly anticipated a decorative noblewoman and received instead someone who had done her legal research, approved the request within 48 hours. Adrian heard all of this through the quiet channels that fed information to people of his rank. Not gossip, exactly, but the constant low current of intelligence that flowed between advisors and secretaries and the particular category of court officials who understood that their job was to know things before they became significant. On the 11th day, he sent her a note. It said, "There is a meeting of the Northern Relief Committee next Thursday. Your attendance would be welcome, if you have time." No flattery, no reference to what had happened at the banquet, no acknowledgement of the letter she had sent him, just an invitation to a room where the work she was already doing would find its most useful application. Her response arrived within the hour. It said, "I'll be there." 2 words. He found himself smiling at them for longer than was entirely appropriate. At Blackmore Hall, the silence between husband and wife had acquired a new density. Nathaniel had arrived home from the banquet 3 hours after Vivienne, and when he walked through the main entrance and heard nothing, no movement, no voice, not even the ambient sound of another person existing somewhere in the house, he had felt something that took him a moment to identify. Relief and guilt arriving simultaneously, which was, in his experience, the most uncomfortable combination a person could produce. He went to his study. He poured a drink he didn't want. He sat in the dark for an hour and told himself he had done nothing wrong. The marriage was a political arrangement. Eleonora understood who he was and what he needed in a way that Vivienne, in her careful composure and her constant quiet assessment of everything around her, simply did not. He had spoken the truth at the banquet. Bluntly, yes. Publicly, yes. But truth was truth. He repeated this to himself several times. It didn't settle. The problem, and Nathaniel Blackmore was, beneath all his cultivated indifference, an honest man when he was alone with himself at 3 a.m, was that he had not spoken the full truth. He had spoken the version of the truth that served the performance he was putting on for Eleonora, the version that made him look like a man in control of his circumstances rather than a man drowning in them. The full truth was more complicated and less flattering. The full truth was that in the 6 weeks since Vivienne Ashford had arrived at Blackmore Hall, she had quietly, systematically, and without ever asking for recognition, begun doing every single thing he had been failing to do. She had noticed the tenant problems he had delegated away and forgotten. She had learned the names of every member of his household staff, including the 2 kitchen workers he couldn't have identified in a lineup. She had organized his estate correspondence into a filing system that actually made sense. She had also, in the space of a single dinner conversation, seen through the precisely trimmed hedgerows to the man who needed to control everything because he was terrified of what he'd become if he stopped. No one had done that before, not even Eleonora, who knew him well, but had never once looked at his compulsions and named them without flinching. And then he had stood in a ballroom and described that woman as a line item. He poured the undrunk glass of brandy back into the decanter, which struck him later as significant. He had wanted to destroy something and couldn't even manage that much. The morning after the banquet, he knocked on the door of Vivienne's sitting room before entering for the first time since she had moved into Blackmore Hall. She was seated at her writing desk, already dressed, already working. She looked up when he entered. Her eyes went to his face, assessed what they found there, and returned to her correspondence. She didn't speak. "I should—" he started. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "I'm not interested in an apology that you're offering because it's socially necessary," she said, not looking up from her writing. "If you have something you actually mean to say, come back when you've figured out what it is. I have letters to write." "Those letters." "The Relief Committee. The Northern Relief Committee is meeting Thursday. Administrator Fowler has approved my access to the estate yield records, which I'll be presenting as part of a proposal for winter resource allocation to the 6 most critically undersupplied tenant communities on your northern holdings." Now she looked up. "Your northern holdings, not mine, not ours. The ones you've been receiving income from for 7 years while the people working them couldn't afford physicians." The air between them had the quality of the moment before a thunderstorm, charged, pressurized, waiting. "You could have discussed this with me," Nathaniel said carefully. "I tried. You told me tenant welfare was a line item." He had no answer for that. It was exactly what he'd said. She returned to her writing. "Close the door on your way out." He closed the door. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand still on the handle, breathing through something that sat in his chest like a stone. Not remorse exactly, because remorse implied he'd stopped justifying himself, which he hadn't entirely. But adjacent to remorse. In the same territory. He walked away. He told himself he would deal with this later, which was what he told himself about every problem that required him to be worse than he preferred to believe he was. 3 weeks passed. Then 6. The kingdom watched Vivienne Blackmore with the focused, slightly incredulous attention of people who had been expecting a scandal and instead received a revelation. She appeared at the Northern Relief Committee not as a decorative patron, but as a functional contributor. The yield records she presented, cross-referenced with population data, weather patterns, and historical allocation figures she had personally compiled, formed the basis of a resource redistribution plan that the committee's senior members immediately recognized as both comprehensive and actionable. Men who had spent decades navigating the kingdom's charitable infrastructure sat across the table from a 26-year-old duchess and received a briefing that left most of them scrambling to take notes. Countess Marlowe, who had attended these meetings for 15 years and developed a finely calibrated sense for the difference between philanthropic performance and actual competence, told 3 separate people afterward that Vivian Blackmore was the most effective new committee member she had seen in a decade. The Countess was not a woman who gave compliments casually, and the remark traveled through the court's social network with the speed and precision of a well-aimed arrow. 2 weeks after the committee meeting, Vivian visited the Miller family on Blackmore's western estate. She brought a physician. She also brought seed stocks for spring planting, a written request to the estate steward authorizing roof repairs on 4 additional tenant properties, and a small sum drawn from her own personal accounts, the Ashford settlement money that was hers legally and entirely, having been transferred before the marriage contract was finalized. The Millers told people. The Millers told everyone. Across the kingdom's noble households, the story being told about Nathaniel Blackmore's wife began to change. And as it changed, the story being told about Nathaniel Blackmore began to change with it, which was the part that brought the specific, corrosive discomfort that sat in him like acid when his social secretary placed the latest round of correspondence on his desk, and he read, in 3 separate letters from 3 separate powerful men, complimentary references to the Duchess of Blackmore's charitable work that were clearly worded to function simultaneously as criticisms of his own. He stood at his desk and read the letters twice each and didn't speak for a long time. Mrs. Calloway, who had been with the Blackmore household for 22 years and had survived both the father's scandals and the son's various forms of damage, knocked on his study door that afternoon. "My lord," she said, and waited. "Whatever it is," he said, "Lady Vivian has arranged for the East Wing staff quarters to be renovated. The plans have already been approved by the household accounts. It falls within her authority as Duchess. I wanted you to know before the builders arrived." He turned from the window. "She's renovating the staff quarters. The East Wing rooms haven't been updated in 12 years. 3 of the household staff have been sleeping in rooms with damp in the walls." Mrs. Calloway's voice was entirely neutral. 22 years had made her very good at neutral. She noticed. "I didn't notice," Nathaniel said. "No, my lord." The silence that followed had the particular quality of a statement neither of them was going to acknowledge out loud. "Tell the builders to proceed," he said finally. "Yes, my lord." It was at the winter gala hosted by the Marquis of Westhaven, the first major court event since the royal banquet, that the shift in social atmosphere became impossible to ignore. Nathaniel arrived with Vivian because the alternative was arriving alone, which would have communicated a state of martial dysfunction that he was not yet prepared to acknowledge publicly. She wore deep burgundy. Her hair was arranged in the same unadorned style as the banquet. She wore her mother's earrings again. The difference was the way the room received her. At the royal banquet, she had entered as the new Duchess of Blackmore, assessed, catalogued, filed under category of political acquisition. At the Westhaven Gala, she entered as something else. The shift was subtle but architecturally significant, the way a foundation crack is subtle but tells you everything about whether the building is going to stand. People came to her. Not in the servile, attendance-paying way of those acknowledging rank, in the specific, interested way of those who had heard about the Northern Relief Committee presentation and the Miller family visit and the staff quarters renovation, and who wanted, with the sharpened social appetite of those who trafficked in significance, to be in proximity to whatever was building around this woman. Nathaniel watched it happen from across the room. He held his champagne and watched his wife move through the gathering with the same quality of quiet attention she applied to everything, not performing warmth, not manufacturing approachability, simply being genuinely interested in the people in front of her and making each of them feel, for the duration of their exchange, that what they were saying was the most important thing being said in the room. It was not a skill that could be taught. Either you had the capacity to be genuinely present with another human being, or you didn't. He didn't. He had never particularly wanted to. Until this moment, Standing across a room watching his wife demonstrate it at a level that was making four of the most politically significant people in the kingdom forget they were supposed to be networking with each other. Remarkable woman. Lord Harrington appeared at his elbow with the unerring instinct of a man who had spent 50 years finding exactly the worst possible moment to make observations. Yes, Nathaniel said, because denying it would have been worse. Word from the Agricultural Ministry is that her proposal for the northern tenants is being considered as a model for broader regional reform. Apparently Fowler hasn't seen data quality like that from a private submission in years. Harrington sipped his champagne. You always know what you've got, Blackmore? What? You know what you have, before you lose it. He drifted away into the crowd before Nathaniel could respond. Nathaniel set his untouched champagne on a passing tray. Across the room, Vivian was speaking with Prince Adrian Ravenshire. They stood slightly apart from the surrounding groups, and the quality of their conversation was different from the other exchanges she'd had. Not the engaged but public warmth she extended to everyone, but something quieter and more direct. Adrian was listening with the particular intensity he reserved for things he actually found significant, his head slightly tilted, his eyes on her face. She was speaking with her hands in a way Nathaniel had never seen her do before. Small, quick gestures that suggested she was talking about something she cared about rather than something she was navigating. He watched his wife laugh for the first time since he had known her. It was not directed at him. It was not for him. It was entirely hers, produced by something Prince Adrian Ravenshire had said, and it transformed her face in a way that landed somewhere in Nathaniel Blackmore's chest with the force of a precisely placed hit. This was the moment. Not the banquet, not the cold mornings of silence at Blackmore Hall, not the letter he had found on his desk one afternoon in Vivian's handwriting, requesting the estate steward's authority codes in terms so legally exact he couldn't have refused without a fight. This was the moment when Nathaniel understood that something was happening that he had no mechanism for stopping. Because she wasn't fighting him. She wasn't punishing him. She wasn't performing suffering for the court's consumption or engineering a scandal to balance the one he had manufactured. She was simply becoming, expanding into the space he had vacated by refusing to see her, growing into the room that his contempt had accidentally opened. And the court, the shrewd, cold-blooded, eternally calculating court, was watching her grow and making the adjustments that courts always make when they recognize where the real power in a relationship is starting to reside. He crossed the room. It was the first unplanned thing he had done in months. "Vivian," he said, arriving beside her and Adrian with a composure that cost him significantly more than it appeared to. She turned. The laughter left her face in the time it took her eyes to find his, replaced by the carefully modulated neutrality she wore around him. Not hostile, not wounded, just absent. The expression of someone who has decided not to waste energy on a response that won't land anywhere useful. "Nathaniel," she said. "Your Highness," Nathaniel said to Adrian. Adrian regarded him with the kind of measured, entirely unintimidated calm that came from a man who had never needed anything from Nathaniel Blackmore and wasn't about to start. "Blackmore," he said, "we were just discussing the Northern Relief Committee's spring initiative. Your wife has been doing extraordinary work." "I know," Nathaniel said. A brief pause. Three people in a circle, each one aware of exactly how much was not being said. "I was hoping," Nathaniel said, looking at Vivian, "that you would dance with me." Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise, not softening, but a rapid internal calculation that he recognized because he used the same process himself. Assessing cost. Assessing what refusal communicated versus what acceptance communicated. Choosing the option that served her position rather than her preference. "Of course," she said. On the dance floor, they moved correctly. Their form was impeccable, the product of the same childhood training that had prepared them both to perform dignity under conditions that made dignity expensive. Her hand in his was careful, not stiff. Careful. The distinction between the two was the difference between someone who was afraid of you and someone who had decided you didn't merit the energy of strong feeling. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes." "The committee work, the tenants, the staff quarters." The staff quarters needed renovation. The damp was causing respiratory problems. She looked past his shoulder at the room. You would have noticed if you ever walked through that part of the house. I'm noticing a great deal of things I should have noticed earlier. That's good, she said. For you. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. She continued looking past him. I was wrong, he said. At the banquet. What I said. I know you were wrong. Her voice was entirely level. You also knew it at the time. That's the part I can't get past, Nathaniel. You knew. The orchestra played. Their feet moved. Around them, the court watched with the transparent pretense of people who were absolutely not watching. What do you want from me? He asked. She finally looked at him directly. Her gray eyes were exactly as he remembered them from the banquet, holding nothing back and asking for nothing. But there was something new in them now, not contempt, something cooler. The expression of a woman who has done her accounting and found that the numbers don't work. I wanted to be seen, she said. I'm not sure I want that from you anymore. She didn't say it with anger. She didn't need to. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather, accurately, without attachment to whether the weather agrees with you. The music ended. She stepped back and excused herself with the precise social grace she applied to everything, and within 30 seconds she was back across the room, back beside Adrian, back in the world she had been building without him. Nathaniel stood on the dance floor for a moment longer than he should have. Then he walked to the edge of the room and found the door that led to the private corridor, and he stood there in the dark, not because he needed air, but because he needed 30 seconds of not being watched while he figured out what the sensation in his chest actually was. He had acquired Vivian Ashford to solve a problem. He had given her a title and a house and a place at his table and considered the transaction complete. What he understood, standing alone in the dark corridor while the orchestra struck up the next set, was that he had given her all of that, and in doing so had given her the platform to become exactly the person she had always been, the person he had never looked at long enough to see. And now every powerful eye in the kingdom was turning toward her, and she had looked at him on a dance floor and told him, without a single raised voice or wasted word, that she was no longer waiting for him. He went back into the ballroom because he had no choice. He stood in rooms and spoke to people and performed the function of Duke Blackmore with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been performing it since he was 17 years old. But something was broken that he didn't have the tools to repair. Not in her. In himself. The specific necessary part that allows a person to see another person before it's too late. He didn't know it was already too late. He would. The following morning, a sealed communication arrived at Blackmore Hall addressed to the Duchess, bearing the official seal of the Royal Court Charitable Foundation. Inside was a formal invitation for Vivian Blackmore to present her Northern Territory reform proposal to a full session of the Royal Advisory Council, the room where policy became law and names became legacies. Vivian read it twice at her writing desk. Then she placed it in the leather folder where she kept her most important documents, and she wrote 3 letters. The first was to Administrator Fowler, confirming the presentation date. The second was to Countess Marlowe, requesting a strategic meeting. The third was to Prince Adrian Ravenshire. It said, Thursday, bring the Northern census figures. We have work to do. She sealed all 3 letters and handed them to the footman for dispatch, and then she opened her notebook to a clean page and began outlining the presentation that would put her name on the tongue of every person in the Advisory Council chamber. Downstairs, Nathaniel Blackmore received, in the same Morning Post, a personal note from Lord Harrington. It contained 5 words. You know what you had. Past tense. The Royal Advisory Council chamber smelled like old wood and older ambition. Vivian had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the furniture itself seemed to carry the accumulated weight of every decision ever made inside them, where the portraits on the walls were not decoration but surveillance, the dead eyes of previous power watching to see whether the living had learned anything useful from their example. She had grown up watching her father navigate rooms like this. She had spent her childhood learning to read them. She set her leather folder on the presentation table and did not let her hands tremble. 14 men, 3 women, Countess Marlowe, Lady Sutherland, and the formidable Duchess of Pembridge, who had been on the Advisory Council for 11 years and was known for asking the question that everyone else in the room had been too cautious to voice. The full council convened for a formal policy session. The kind of room where careers were made and quietly ended before the tea went cold. Prince Adrian sat at the far end of the table, not in his official capacity as a council observer, but close enough to it that the distinction was largely ceremonial. He had sent her the Northern Census figures the previous evening, annotated in his own handwriting with 3 specific data points he thought she should lead with. She had used all 3. The Blackmore Northern Territory Reform Proposal, said Council Chairman Aldwin, a thin man with the careful diction of someone who had spent 40 years ensuring his words could not be quoted against him, submitted by the Duchess of Blackmore. Your Grace, the floor is yours. Vivian stood. She had spent 8 days preparing this presentation. Not the data. The data she had assembled over weeks of cross-referencing records, visiting sites, and speaking directly to the people the numbers represented. She had spent 8 days preparing to deliver the data in a room full of people whose default response to anything proposed by a woman under 30 was polite skepticism, followed by bureaucratic delay. She opened the folder and began. 40 minutes later, she closed it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence at the end of most presentations. Most silences after presentations were the silence of people deciding what to say. This was the silence of people who had already decided but were taking a moment to acknowledge that the ground had shifted slightly under their feet. Duchess Pembridge spoke first. The cost projections for Year 1. Walk me through the Harrow District allocation specifically. Vivian walked her through it. Pembridge asked 2 follow-up questions, both precise, both aimed at the exact stress points in the proposal that Vivian had identified herself as potential weaknesses. She had answers for both. Not performed answers, real ones, with the numbers to back them. Pembridge sat back. This is well-constructed work, she said, and in this room, from this woman, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The discussion that followed lasted another hour. By the end of it, Council Chairman Aldwin had announced that the proposal would be formally entered into the spring legislative review, the pathway that led, if things proceeded as they should, to actual implementation. Actual change. Actual families in the Northern Territories getting what they needed to survive winters that had been killing the margins off their existences for years. Vivian gathered her folder and kept her face composed through the congratulations and the handshakes and the careful political warmth of people who were now recalculating her significance. She was professional about it. She was gracious. She saved the full weight of the moment for the carriage ride back to Blackmore Hall, where she sat alone and let herself feel, for exactly 12 minutes, what it meant to have walked into a room that wasn't built for her and made it listen. Adrian caught her in the corridor before she reached the main entrance. Pembridge asked you the hard questions, he said, falling into step beside her. I know. I was grateful. He glanced at her. Most people aren't grateful when Pembridge goes after their weak points. Most people haven't had their weak points identified and ignored for the past 2 months. Having someone take them seriously enough to challenge them directly is, she paused, searching for the accurate word, clarifying. They walked in silence for a moment. Outside, through the tall corridor windows, the winter sky was the flat white of a page not yet written on. The council will move on this, Adrian said. Not quickly. Nothing moves quickly through Aldwin's committee structure. But it will move. Your name will be attached to it. That wasn't the point. I know it wasn't. That's why it matters that it happened anyway. She stopped walking, turned to look at him. He had the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of emphasis, not gesturing toward a thought, but simply inhabiting it, letting it exist in the air between them without decoration. Thank you, she said, for the census figures, for the introduction to Countess Marlowe, for... She stopped. For the letter, he said quietly. You don't need to thank me for the letter. You wrote it. I just answered it. Something passed between them that neither of them named. The corridor was empty. The winter light came in flat and cold through the windows and made everything look very clear and very still. I should get back, Vivian said. Yes, Adrian said. She left. He watched her go with the expression of a man who is keeping very careful track of what he is and is not allowing himself to feel. The letter arrived at Blackmore Hall 4 days later. It came in the Morning Post, buried between a state correspondence and a formal notice from the Ministry of Agriculture acknowledging receipt of the council proposal. It bore no return seal. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, controlled, masculine, and deliberate in the way of someone who wanted it to look incidental. Vivian almost didn't open it first, but something about the handwriting made her set the other correspondence aside. Inside were 2 pages. The first was a copy of a letter, not the original, but a careful transcription, the kind made by someone who wanted to preserve content without leaving the original in a place where it could be traced. The second page had 4 sentences on it. She read the transcription first. It was dated 6 weeks ago. It was addressed to Lord Elias Fenwick, a senior member of the Northern Territory Landholders Association, the consortium of private landowners whose cooperation was essential to any reform proposal that touched the northern estates. It was signed by Nathaniel Blackmore. It said, in the precise, bloodless language of a man who had spent his life communicating through legal instruments, that the Duchess of Blackmore's charitable activities, while personally well-intentioned, did not represent the position of the Blackmore estate on questions of Northern Territory reform, that the Duke did not endorse any proposal that would require mandatory infrastructure investment from private landholders, that Lord Fenwick and his associates could be assured that the proposal currently under development by the Duchess would not have the Blackmore estate's formal backing in the legislative review process, and that any support they provided to blocking the proposal's progress through committee would be recognized and reciprocated in the renegotiation of Northern Territory lease agreements scheduled for the following spring. He had written it, signed it, sent it. 6 weeks ago, while she was still compiling the data, before the committee presentation, before the council session, while she was working 14-hour days at his desk in his house using his estate records to build something that would help the people who worked his land, he had been working to destroy it from the inside while she was still building it. Vivian set the letter down on her writing desk. She pressed her palms flat against the wood surface. The room was very quiet. Outside, a groundskeeper was raking the gravel path with the steady, mechanical rhythm of someone who had been doing the same task for so long that the motion had become involuntary, the mind somewhere else entirely, while the body continued its function. She thought about the council session, about Pembridge asking the hard questions, about Adrian's census figures annotated in his careful handwriting, about 40 minutes of standing in front of 14 people and making a case for something that mattered, feeling, for the first time since she had walked through the doors of Blackmore Hall, that she was operating as her full self rather than a reduced version maintained for someone else's comfort. She thought about Nathaniel asking her to dance at the West Haven Gala, his voice when he said I was wrong, the performance of a man gesturing toward accountability without actually arriving there. She read the second page. 4 sentences. The enclosed was obtained from Lord Fenwick's private correspondence. 3 members of the Landholders Association have already submitted formal objections to the Council's legislative review process. The proposal will not survive the spring committee review without Blackmore estate endorsement. You should know what was done. No signature. Not anonymous. The absence of a name was its own kind of identification. The mark of someone with access to Fenwick's private correspondence who had chosen to put this information in her hands rather than anywhere else. She sat with it for a long time. The groundskeeper finished raking and moved on, and the gravel settled back into its precise geometric pattern, undisturbed by anything as unpredictable as weather or intention. Then she stood up. She put on her coat. She walked downstairs and found Nathaniel in his study, going over estate accounts with the focused efficiency of a man who was very comfortable managing numbers and very uncomfortable managing people. "Close the accounts," she said. He looked up, read something in her face, closed the ledger. "Vivian, Lord Elias Fenwick," she said, "the Landholders Association, a letter dated 6 weeks ago." The color left his face in a way that told her everything she needed to confirm, not guilt performing itself dramatically, just the specific involuntary pallor of a man who has been holding something in place by sheer effort and has just felt the thing give way. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question. "Does it matter?" "It matters a great deal who has access to Nathaniel." Her voice was very quiet and very even, and the effect of it was worse than shouting. "Does it matter where I got it? Or does it matter that you wrote it?" The study was all dark wood and heavy curtains and the smell of old paper, the kind of room that was designed to make the person sitting behind the desk feel substantial and everyone else feel peripheral. Vivian stood in front of the desk and did not feel peripheral. She felt like the only real thing in the room. The proposal would have cost the Blackmore estate 12% of Northern Territory lease income over 5 years, Nathaniel said. His voice was controlled. He was receding into the language of economics because it was safer than any other language available to him right now. The Landholders Association collectively controls access to... Stop. He stopped. Don't give me the financial analysis, she said. I have the financial analysis. I built it. I know exactly what the proposal cost the Blackmore estate, and I know exactly what the current arrangement costs the people living on Blackmore land, and I made a choice about which of those numbers mattered more. You made a different choice. That's not what I'm standing here for. Then what are you standing here for? I'm standing here because you let me work. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not from tears, but from the particular internal pressure of a feeling that is too large for the container trying to hold it. 6 weeks. You let me build something. You let me walk into that council chamber and present it to 14 people and feel... She stopped, breathed, continued. And the entire time you were writing letters to make sure it failed. You watched me work and you said nothing. You asked me to dance. You said you were wrong. You said it. And underneath all of it, you were making sure that every hour I put into that proposal was wasted. It wasn't personal, he said. And then something in his own voice seemed to hear what he'd just said, because his jaw tightened and he looked away. Everything you do is personal, Vivian said. You just never admit it. That's the only real skill you have. Performing indifference about things that matter to you, and then destroying them when no one's watching. The silence that came after that was the longest silence the house had produced. Longer than the dinner on the first night. Longer than the morning after the banquet. This one had depth to it. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of every conversation they hadn't had, every moment of almost recognition he had retreated from, every small destruction accumulated into something irreparable. The proposal was going to fail anyway, he said finally. Fenwick had 3 votes before I wrote anything. The Landholders Association was going to block it regardless, and you added your weight to their side to protect your lease agreements. She picked up the letter from where she had placed it on his desk. I know, I understand the mechanics. I even understand why, in the cold accounting of estate management, it made sense to you. She folded the letter with the careful precision she applied to everything. What I don't understand is why you asked me to dance. He didn't answer. What were you trying to... She stopped, looked at him, let herself actually look at him for the first time in weeks, past the management of the interaction and the maintenance of her own composure, just looked at the actual man sitting behind the desk. The jaw set the same way her father's jaw set when he was performing composure. The eyes that had looked at her on a dance floor with something she had almost let herself believe was genuine. You don't know, she said, quietly, almost to herself. That's the worst part. You genuinely don't know what you want from me. You can't stand the thought of being irrelevant to me, and you can't bring yourself to stop being the reason I can't succeed. And you think those two things can exist simultaneously without cost. She put the folded letter in her coat pocket. I'm going to Adrian, she said. We need to assess the damage and rebuild the coalition before the spring committee review. If the proposal can still be salvaged, I intend to salvage it, without Blackmore estate endorsement if necessary. Nathaniel stood up from behind the desk. For a moment, something shifted in his face. Not the usual control mechanisms, but something underneath them. Something raw and cornered. Vivian, if you go to Adrian with this... What? Not a question. A door. The court will draw conclusions. The court already has conclusions, she said. They drew them the night you described me as a line item in a ballroom full of people. I've been living inside those conclusions ever since. I'm done managing the optics of a marriage that only exists as a document. She walked to the study door, her hand on the handle. Then she stopped, not because she wavered, but because there was one more thing that needed to be said, and she had learned from watching people fail at this their entire lives that leaving things unsaid was how wounds stayed open. She turned back. You had something real, she said. I was prepared to build something real with you, not a love story. I wasn't naive enough for that, but a partnership, a genuine one, where we were actually on the same side of something that mattered. She held his gaze. You chose the lease agreements. She left. The door didn't slam. That was the part that stayed with him. the door closing with the same quiet, complete finality as everything else she did. No performance, no gesture toward the theatrical, just the soft mechanical click of a latch engaging, and then the sound of her footsteps on the corridor floor, steady and receding, carrying her away from him towards something he had no part in and no claim on. Nathaniel Blackmore stood in his study, surrounded by his accounts and his furniture, and the accumulated evidence of a life spent managing everything except the things that mattered, and he understood, with the cold, specific clarity that comes only when it is too late to be useful, that he had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Not the letter to Fenwick. That was a symptom. The mistake was everything before it. Every morning he had ridden out instead of staying, every dinner in his study instead of at the table, every conversation he had ended before it could cost him anything, every small, deliberate choice to remain sealed rather than risk the exposure of being known. He had built the perfect defense against being hurt, and inside it, perfectly protected, he had destroyed the only person who had ever looked at him clearly and stayed anyway. Outside his window, the winter sky was white and absolute. On the gravel path, the geometric pattern the groundskeeper had raked that morning was already beginning to blur at the edges where the wind was working at it, patient and indifferent, undoing precision the way everything eventually undid precision. His hand went to the desk drawer where Harrington's note still sat, 5 words on expensive paper. You know what you had, past tense. He understood now why Harrington had chosen that tense. Not cruelty, accuracy. The old man had seen the ending before Nathaniel had seen anything at all. He sat down. He did not pick up the accounts ledger. He sat with his hands on the desk surface and stared at the door she had closed behind her, and somewhere in the architecture of the man he had spent his entire life constructing, something load-bearing gave way. What grew in the space it left behind was not remorse. Remorse was a feeling. This was something more functional, more demanding. This was the specific, brutal recognition that the version of himself he had been operating as was no longer viable, that the armor had cost more than the wounds it had been built to prevent, that a man who could watch someone work towards something good and spend 6 weeks engineering its failure from the inside was not a man any version of Vivian Ashford would ever choose to stand beside. The question, the only question that remained, was whether the other version, the one that might deserve a different outcome, was still somewhere inside him, or whether he had, through years of deliberate suppression, successfully killed it. He didn't know the answer. He was going to have to find out. And across the city, in the private study of Prince Adrian Ravenshire, a duchess was laying a letter on a desk and beginning a conversation that would change the shape of everything that came next. Not because she planned it that way, but because the truth, once it was in the room, had its own momentum. Adrian's study was warm in the way that rooms become warm when the person inhabiting them has stopped performing their occupation and started actually living it. Books pulled from shelves and left open at significant pages, correspondence stacked in functional rather than decorative order, a fire that had been fed rather than arranged. Vivian sat across from him at the working table he used when he wasn't receiving official visitors, the letter from her coat pocket now flat between them on the wood surface. Adrian read it once. Then he turned it over and read it again, not because he had missed anything the first time, but because he was the kind of man who verified before he reacted, who made certain his anger was aimed at the right thing before he let it move. When he set it down, his face was very still. 6 weeks, he said. Yes. While you were building the data set. Yes. He pushed back from the table slightly. Not away from her, away from the letter, as though proximity to it required a physical adjustment. The Landholders Association has 3 votes on the spring committee, with Blackmore's weight added to the opposition. He stopped, worked the numbers visibly, the way a man does when he already knows what they add up to and is buying time before saying it out loud. The proposal survives the review in its current form if we hold every other vote solid. We lose 1 defection, and it goes back to subcommittee, which means another year, which means another winter in the northern districts without the allocation changes. I know. The Blackmore endorsement was the load-bearing wall. I know that too. He looked at her. She was sitting straight, coat still on, the letter between them like something that had been detonated and was still smoking. Her face was exactly what it always was. Composed, clear-eyed, giving nothing away that hadn't been deliberately released. But he had spent enough time in her company over the past months to read the things she didn't perform. the specific quality of stillness that meant she was holding something large very carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the first time anyone had asked her that since the banquet. Since before the banquet, possibly. She absorbed the question for a moment, the way you absorb something that lands in an unexpected location. "I will be," she said. "Right now I need to know if the proposal can be saved." He accepted that. He didn't push it. It was one of the things she had come to rely on without quite naming it. His ability to understand when a person needed to work through a problem before they could afford to feel it. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. Fenwick is the keystone. The other two association votes follow his lead. That's been consistent across the last 4 committee cycles. I checked the records. If we can move Fenwick, the association fractures. He's not ideologically opposed to Northern Territory reform. He's opposed to mandatory cost allocation, which means if we restructure the investment mechanism, Adrian said, picking up the thread, shift from mandatory capital expenditure to a voluntary improvement incentive tied to lease renewal terms, the landlords who invest in tenant infrastructure get preferential lease renewal rates, the ones who don't pay market rate at open renewal. The reform still happens. The timeline shifts, the mechanism changes, but the outcome for the Northern families remains substantially equivalent. He was already reaching for paper. It's a harder sell to the council's progressive bloc. Marlowe is going to want mandatory provisions. Marlowe wants outcomes. If I can show her the outcomes are protected under the incentive model, she'll back it. She's pragmatic. And Nathaniel's formal opposition? The name landed in the room. Neither of them looked away from the other. "Becomes irrelevant," Vivian said, "if Fenwick moves. Nathaniel will have spent his political capital on a blocking effort that didn't block, which will cost him considerably more than 12% of Northern lease income over 5 years. Adrian studied her face for a moment. "You thought all of this through on the way here." "I had the carriage ride." He almost smiled. Then he picked up his pen. "Give me 48 hours to reach Fenwick through back channels. He owes me a conversation on an unrelated matter. I can use that opening without telegraphing our intent. I'll prepare the restructured proposal tonight." Tonight. The spring committee review convenes in 11 days. He nodded once, the curt acknowledgement of someone shifting from assessment into operational mode. "Tonight, then." She gathered the letter from the table and stood. He stood with her. Not a formal gesture, just the automatic response of a man whose instincts toward her had stopped being calculated. "Vivienne." He said her name the way he always said it, without the title, which was technically presumptuous and which she had never corrected. "What you built, the original proposal, the data, the council presentation, that stands regardless of what Nathaniel did. That work existed before he tried to erase it, and it exists after. He didn't touch the work. He just tried to make sure it didn't matter," she said. "I know. That's the part that—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "That's the part I'm working on." She left before he could say anything else. He stood at his study window and watched the carriage pull away. And then he sat down and began writing a letter to Lord Fenwick that would need to be calibrated to within 1 degree of perfect. Informative enough to open the door, restrained enough not to foreclose the negotiation before it started. He wrote 3 drafts before he was satisfied. It was the most careful letter he had ever composed about something that was not, technically, his business. He sent it anyway. The next 8 days were the closest thing to warfare Vivian had experienced in a life spent navigating rooms designed to exclude her. She rewrote the proposal in 3 nights, sleeping 4 hours between sessions, working at the writing desk in her Blackmore Hall suite with the door locked and a pot of coffee that Mrs. Calloway delivered without comment or question. The restructured incentive model required a complete re-engineering of the financial projections. Not cosmetic changes, but architectural ones, the kind that required her to take apart everything she had built and reconstruct it along a different load path while ensuring the structure still held the same weight. She finished it on the 3rd morning as the winter dawn was coming in gray and cold through the window, and she read it through twice with the merciless eyes of someone looking for the thing that would be used against them. She found 2 vulnerabilities. She addressed them. She sent the revised document to Adrian with a note that said simply, "Stress test the Harrow projections. That's where they'll hit hardest." His response arrived 6 hours later. "Harrow projections hold. Fenwick meeting confirmed for tomorrow. Come alone." His request, not mine. She went alone. Lord Elias Fenwick was 71 years old, owned more Northern Territory land than any single private holder in the kingdom's history, and had survived 6 monarchs, 4 major political restructurings, and the kind of accumulated betrayals that turned most men either vicious or philosophical. Fenwick had become both, which made him formidable in a way that neither quality achieved separately. He received her in his private library, standing rather than seated, which she recognized as a deliberate choice, the posture of a man conducting an assessment rather than a meeting. "Duchess Blackmore," he said, "you look like someone who hasn't slept in 3 days." "4," she said, "but I appreciate the generosity." He studied her for a moment, then he gestured to the chairs by the fire. They sat. "Your proposal," he said, "in its original form, would have cost my operations approximately 9% annually over a 5-year implementation period. I know, I calculated it. Most people who calculate things like that have the grace to pretend they haven't. I find pretending expensive." Fenwick's eyes sharpened fractionally, the look of a man encountering something that requires recalibration. "Your husband's letter to me suggested you were operating without his knowledge or backing." He was correct on both counts at the time of writing. She met his gaze without apology. He's since made his position more explicit. "And yet you're here." "And yet I'm here." The fire crackled between them. Fenwick leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had been the most powerful person in enough rooms that it no longer required effort. "Why?" he said. "Not the political reasoning. I understand the political reasoning. Why does it matter to you personally?" She thought about not answering directly. Then she thought about the Miller family's youngest daughter, who had been coughing in a damp room while someone calculated the cost of a physician. She thought about 6 northern tenant families living on subsistence margins on land that produced income for a man who never visited. "Because they're real people," she said, "and the distance between them and the people making decisions about their lives is maintained entirely by paperwork and convenience. I'm in a position to reduce that distance. That's all." Fenwick was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the tone had shifted. Not warmer exactly, but a degree less defensive. "Show me the restructured model," he said. She showed him. 2 hours later, she walked out of Fenwick's library with a conditional commitment that fell 3 votes short of blocking the proposal, and a list of 4 specific modifications he needed to see in the final text before he would formalize his position. She sent Adrian the list from the carriage. His response? "All 4 are workable. I'll have the council drafting office ready by morning." It was on the 6th day, 3 days before the spring committee review convened, that Nathaniel came to her rooms. She had known he would come. The timing and the manner were the only variables. He knocked, which was itself a change, a small structural concession to the fact that the door between them was no longer one he could treat as his own. She opened it herself rather than waiting for a maid because she wanted to see his face before he had time to compose it. He looked like a man who had not slept well in 8 days, which was accurate. He also looked like a man who had made a decision and was committed to it past the point of comfortable reversal, which was something she hadn't seen on him before and which she filed away carefully. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Come in," she said, and left him to close the door behind him. He stood in the center of her sitting room, the room she had made her own over the months, with small, deliberate accumulations of her actual self. Books stacked in the order she was reading them, a map of the Northern Territories pinned to the wall with annotation marks, the leather folder on the writing desk, a spare pen, and an ink bottle that had been refilled so many times the label was illegible. He looked at it all with the expression of a man seeing a room he had thought he knew and discovering it had been somewhere else entirely the whole time. "I withdrew the letter," he said. She turned from the window. "What?" "The letter to Fenwick. I sent a formal withdrawal to his legal counsel this morning, and a separate communication to the other 2 association members who had received correspondence from me on the matter, retracting any implication that the Blackmore Estates position was opposed to the reform proposal." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "And a formal letter of endorsement, submitted to Council Chairman Aldwin, supporting the proposal's passage through spring committee review." She looked at the document. She didn't take it. Why? Not what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief, or satisfaction, or the cold vindication of a position that had been proved right. Instead, she felt the particular wariness of someone who had been hit from an unexpected direction often enough that unexpected things now required verification. "Because I was wrong," he said. "Not just at the banquet. Here. The letter. All of it." He set the document on the edge of the writing desk because she hadn't taken it, and he needed to put it somewhere. I've spent a great deal of time in the past 8 days sitting with what you said to me, about watching you work, about the dance." "Nathaniel, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly, with the controlled urgency of a man who has rehearsed his own worst-case version of this conversation and is trying to get ahead of it. I'm not under the impression that withdrawing a letter undoes what I did. I know what it doesn't undo." He met her eyes. "I know, I'm not. This isn't a negotiation." "Then what is it?" "It's the right thing," he said simply. "The proposal is right. What you built is right. And I used my position to try to stop it because I was protecting my lease income and because—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment with the effort of producing something that had clearly not been spoken out loud before and was resistant to being spoken out loud now. "Because watching you succeed at something I had nothing to do with made me feel I couldn't handle—" "Irrelevant," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Yes." The word sat between them with the specific weight of a true thing said too late. "The endorsement will hold through the committee review," he said. "I'll attend the session in person if that's strategically useful. I'll answer directly to the council if anyone questions the change in position. I'll take the political cost of having changed my position publicly, which is considerable. I'll do whatever is necessary to give the proposal the best chance of passage." He picked up the document from the desk and held it out to her again. "That's all I came to say." She took the document this time. She unfolded it and read it. All of it. Not skimming, not performing due diligence, actually reading. The formal language of the endorsement was exactly what it needed to be. The signature was his. The seal was the Blackmore estate seal. She refolded it carefully. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He turned toward the door. "Nathaniel." He stopped. Didn't turn back fully. Three-quarter profile, the angle of someone who has been expecting to be called back and is still surprised by it. "Why Eleonora?" she said. "At the banquet. Of every way you could have. Why her? Why that night?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Because she makes me feel like the version of myself I was before I understood what I'd become," he said. "And I knew it was a lie. I knew it the whole time, but a lie that feels good in the short term is easier than the truth that requires you to be someone different." He paused. "I'm aware of how that sounds." "It sounds honest," she said, "which is more than most of what you've given me." He left. The door closed with the same quiet finality as every time before. Vivian stood in her sitting room for a long moment, the endorsement letter in her hand, looking at the map of the Northern Territories on the wall, the annotation marks she had made over months of work, the Harrow District projections, the Miller Farm coordinates, the distribution routes, the shape of a thing she had built entirely by herself out of nothing but the refusal to believe that the distance between power and need was unbridgeable. She placed the endorsement letter in her leather folder next to the restructured proposal. 3 days. The spring committee review convened in 3 days. The morning of the review, a second letter arrived. This one bore no seal and no postage. It had been hand-delivered sometime before dawn, slipped under the main entrance of Blackmore Hall by someone who had not wanted to be seen. Mrs. Calloway brought it to Vivian at the breakfast table, her face carrying the specific neutral expression of a woman who has developed a finely calibrated professional relationship with bad news. Vivian opened it. Inside was a single page. At the top, the letterhead of the Landholders Association, the formal, embossed header that appeared on official communications. Below it, 4 lines. The association had filed a formal legal challenge to the proposal's eligibility for spring committee review, citing a procedural irregularity in the original submission, a technicality regarding the documentation of Blackmore Estate co-signatories at the time of council entry. The challenge, if upheld, would remove the proposal from the spring review schedule entirely. The matter would be referred to the council legal office for a determination that would take, at minimum, 6 to 8 months. Not Fenwick. The other 2. The ones who had received Nathaniel's original letters and who had moved before Fenwick's conditional commitment had time to fracture the block. The procedural irregularity was, Vivian recognized immediately, real. A documentation gap she had not caught because she had been working 14-hour days alone without a legal team. A gap that would not have mattered if Nathaniel's endorsement had been in place at the time of original submission. A gap that was now being used as a surgical instrument. She set the letter down on the breakfast table. Across the city, in the council legal office, a clerk she had never met was preparing to receive a formal challenge that could end 11 months of work in a single administrative morning. And in the chair where she sat, with cold coffee and an untouched plate and the sound of the household beginning its day around her, Vivian Blackmore made a decision that she understood with complete clarity, the kind that only arrives when you have run out of room to negotiate with yourself, would change the shape of everything that came after it. She reached for pen and paper. The letter she wrote was not to Adrian. It was not to Aldwyn. It was not to Fenwick or Countess Marlowe or the council legal office. It was to the king. The letter to the king took 11 minutes to write, not because she labored over the words, because she wrote it 3 times. The first version was too precise, the legal language of a woman defending a position, which was not what this was. The second was too personal, the emotional weight of 11 months bleeding through syntax she couldn't afford in a royal communication. The third was what it needed to be, clear, direct, addressed to a man who had been on the throne for 19 years and had survived enough manufactured crises to recognize the difference between a procedural complaint and a structural indictment of the people around him. She wrote that the Northern Territory Reform Proposal, entered into Spring Committee review under the formal endorsement of the Blackmore estate, was facing a legal challenge filed by 2 members of the Landholders Association on the basis of a documentation gap that had been deliberately manufactured through the withholding of estate co-signatory authorization during the original submission window. She wrote that the families in 6 northern districts were entering their 4th consecutive winter below subsistence allocation. She wrote that she was not requesting intervention. She was requesting that His Majesty be aware of what was happening in the administration beneath him, so that the awareness itself could do what royal awareness did in a court that ran on the constant recalibration of where the king's attention was directed. She sealed it with the Blackmore estate seal, which was hers to use legally as Duchess, and handed it to the household courier with instructions for immediate royal delivery. Then she sent a second letter to Adrian. 7 words. The association filed a legal challenge. Read the Morning Post. His response arrived in 40 minutes. I already know. Come now. The carriage ride to Adrian's residence took 20 minutes through streets that were beginning their day with the particular gray efficiency of a city that doesn't wait for weather to improve before it gets on with business. Vivian sat in the darkness of the cab and let herself feel, for the length of those 20 minutes, the full accumulated weight of what the past 11 months had cost her. Not the political cost, the internal one. The specific erosion that happens when you spend enough time being unseen by someone who is supposed to see you. The way you begin, almost without noticing, to import their blindness. To start looking at yourself through the lens of their indifference. To catch yourself in unguarded moments, wondering whether the things you know yourself to be are actually real, or whether you have been performing them so long in an empty room that the performance has become confused with the person. She had caught herself doing that, multiple times. It was the thing she was most angry about. Not what Nathaniel had said at the banquet, not the letter to Fenwick, not the lease agreement calculations. The internalization, the moments when his version of her had briefly seemed more credible than her own. She was done with that. She had been done with it for some time, but sitting in the carriage with the city moving past the windows, she let herself acknowledge that it had happened and that it had cost her something real, and then she let herself set it down. Not forgive it. Not process it into something comfortable. Just set it down the way you set down a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. The carriage stopped. She got out. She went inside. Adrian was already standing at the working table with 3 documents spread across it, his coat on, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has assessed the situation and arrived at a course of action and is waiting for the other person in the room to catch up. The challenge is procedurally valid, he said, before she had fully closed the door. I've had the council's legal charter reviewed this morning. The documentation gap is real, and the association standing to file is real. I know. The legal determination process takes 6 to 8 months minimum. I know that too. Which means the only way to remove the proposal from the legal determination pathway is a royal override of the review schedule. She came to the table and looked at the documents. One was the formal challenge filing. One was the council legal charter. One was a handwritten set of notes in Adrian's writing, dense and rapid, the marks of a mind that thought faster than it wrote, which His Majesty has the authority to grant under the emergency provision of the 1887 Administrative Charter, in cases where a delayed determination would cause demonstrable harm to citizens of the kingdom. Adrian looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, because he had stopped being surprised by her months ago, but the particular quality of recognition that comes when a person you respect does exactly what you hoped they would do before you had to suggest it. "You wrote to the king," he said. "This morning." "Before you wrote to me." 7 minutes before. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the fourth document she hadn't noticed yet, sitting at the edge of the table. He handed it to her. It was a response. Royal seal. Dated this morning. She read it. The king had not granted the emergency override. What he had granted was an immediate royal inquiry into the conduct of the legal challenge filing, specifically into whether the procedural irregularity being cited had been manufactured through coordinated withholding of required documentation. The inquiry would be conducted by the Council of Senior Advisors. The spring committee review would be suspended, not canceled, pending the inquiry's determination. Determination timeline, 48 hours. "He moved faster than I expected," Vivian said. "He moves fast when someone gives him something real to move on," Adrian said. "He's been watching the association's influence over Northern Territory policy for 3 years. Your letter gave him the specific mechanism he needed." She set the royal response down on the table. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was not entirely steady, but that was a private matter. 48 hours, she said. 48 hours. They looked at each other across the table, covered in documents that represented 11 months of her work and 6 weeks of his and the lives of families in 6 northern districts who had no idea their winter allocation was being decided in a private study in the capital. "We used the 48 hours, she said. "Yes." "I need Countess Marlowe to speak to the 3 swing votes on the committee about the inquiry's implications. If the challenge is found to have been filed in bad faith, the association members involved lose standing on Northern Territory matters for 2 years. That changes the calculus significantly for anyone who is considering joining the blocking effort. I'll reach Marlowe within the hour. And Fenwick needs to know about the inquiry before he hears it from the association side. If his conditional commitment holds through the next 48 hours, we have enough to pass the restructured proposal, even if the swing votes don't move." "Fenwick's commitment holds," Adrian said with the quiet certainty of a man who has read another man accurately and is willing to stake something on it. She nodded. She began gathering the relevant documents. Then she stopped. "Adrian." He was reaching for his coat. He paused. She had been thinking about this since the carriage, about what to say and whether to say it and what it would cost and what it would cost not to. She had run the calculation several times and arrived at the same answer each time, which usually meant the answer was real. "When this is over," she said, "I'm going to petition the royal court for a legal separation from Nathaniel Blackmore. I have grounds. I have documentation. I have the full account of the banquet and the letter to Fenwick, and I have 11 months of a marriage that existed as a document and nothing else." She met his eyes. "I wanted you to know before it happened. Not because it involves you, but because because this year has involved you significantly, and you deserve to hear it from me directly." The room was quiet. The fire in the grate had burned down to coals that threw a low, steady heat without much light. Adrian set his coat down. He came around the end of the table and stopped about 3 feet from her, which was close enough to mean something without being presumptuous about what. "How long have you known?" he said. "Months," she said honestly. "I was waiting until the proposal was through. I didn't want the personal thing to contaminate the work. I needed the work to be about the work." He looked at her for a long moment. His face did what it always did when something mattered to him. It went very still, and the stillness was louder than most people's full expressions. "The separation proceeding will be contested," he said. "Nathaniel has resources and motivation." "I know." The court will scrutinize every aspect of the marriage. I know that too. You'll need, it would be appropriate for you to have support from someone whose position in court carries enough weight to, Adrian, she said gently. He stopped. Not yet, she said. Let me do this one thing at a time. He absorbed that. Nodded once, the specific nod of a man who understands the difference between patience and resignation, and has chosen the former with full awareness of what it requires. One thing at a time, he said. They went to work. The royal inquiry concluded in 31 hours. The determination found that the procedural challenge had been filed using a documentation gap that had been deliberately maintained through the coordinated withholding of co-signatory authorization during the original submission window. Both association members involved lost standing on Northern Territory Committee matters for 24 months. The legal challenge was dismissed. The spring committee review was reinstated. The vote was held 2 days later. The restructured incentive model passed by a margin of 9 votes to 4, with Fenwick voting in favor and the 2 swing votes that Countess Marlowe had reached in the 48-hour window holding firm. Vivian received the result in writing at Blackmore Hall. She read the formal notification at her writing desk in the East Wing suite, and she sat with it for a long time without moving. The leather folder with 11 months of work inside it sat open beside her. The map of the Northern Territories on the wall showed the Harrow District projections in her own handwriting, the annotation marks she had made in the first weeks when she was still learning how far the distance between policy and person actually ran. She had closed that distance. Not entirely. Nothing closed it entirely, but she had moved it. She had taken the gap between a line item and a life and made it smaller, and the making had cost her things she hadn't known she was carrying until she'd put them down on the other side. She closed the leather folder. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was in the East Garden. She hadn't expected that. He never came to the East Garden. But there he was, standing at the edge of the gravel path where it met the first of the precisely trimmed hedgerows, his coat on against the cold, his hands in his pockets, looking at the geometry of the garden with the expression of a man seeing something familiar for the first time. She came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "The proposal passed," she said. "I know. Aldwyn's office notified me this morning. The association members lost their standing. Also know," he paused, "I sent formal communications to both of them this morning as well, expressing my position on their conduct." She looked at him. His jaw was set the way it always set, but there was something different in the lines around his eyes. A loosening of something that had been held so long it had begun to look structural. "Vivian," he said, "I need to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." "All right." He turned to look at her, directly, without the half-angle deflections he usually employed when a conversation required him to be exposed rather than managed. "I spent most of my life," he said, "deciding that the safest position was to want nothing I couldn't replace, nothing that could be taken. If you don't need anything from another person, they can't use it against you. That's the calculation I made at 17 when my father's choices destroyed everything we had, and I never revisited it because it worked. It kept me functional. It kept me in control." He paused. The winter air was very still. "What I didn't account for was what it cost the people I was supposed to be in partnership with. What it cost you. Nathaniel, I'm not finished." She waited. "The banquet," he said. "What I said at the banquet was the most honest I'd been in years, and it was the most destructive thing I've ever done. Not because it was true in the narrow way that the worst things we say are always technically true. But I said it to protect myself from the fact that you were standing in that room being more than I had expected you to be, and that frightened me more than anything I've ever managed." His voice was level, but the control of it was visible. The particular steadiness of a man who has decided that the cost of this conversation is worth paying and is paying it. "I have no excuse for the letter to Fenwick. There's no version of that I can make smaller than what it was. I watched you work, and I used my position to undermine it because I had decided, somewhere beneath the financial reasoning, that if you succeeded too visibly, you would leave. And then I made sure you had every reason to." The garden was silent around them. Frost on the gravel path. The hedgerows standing in their precise formations, every branch directed, nothing allowed to grow where it wasn't planned. "You're describing a man," she said carefully, "who destroys what he's afraid of losing." "Yes, he said. That's accurate. And you understand why that makes you someone I can't build a life with. He was quiet for a moment that cost him something visible. I understand, he said. I'm not asking you to. I stopped having the right to ask you for things some time ago, and I know it. He turned back to the garden. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it. Not as a negotiation, not as an attempt to change your decision, just, you deserve to know that I saw what I had. Too late, but clearly. She stood beside him in the cold air and felt the strange, specific weight of a grief that wasn't for what she was losing, but for what had never been allowed to exist. Not the marriage, the possibility. The version of this that could have been, if he had been a different man or she had arrived at a different time, or the gap between who he was and who he might have been had been slightly smaller. That was the thing about certain kinds of damage. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated in the small daily choices to remain sealed. Every morning riding out instead of staying, every dinner taken alone, every conversation ended before it could cost anything. And then one day you stood in a winter garden looking at hedgerows you had ordered trimmed to the same height for 20 years. And you understood, with the full weight of everything you had not allowed yourself to feel, that control and safety were not the same thing. That you could manage every variable in your environment and still lose the most important thing in it. Nathaniel understood that now. It had taken him 11 months and several specific catastrophes to arrive at the understanding, and he was standing in it with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped running from the thing he feared and found that the thing itself was not the worst part. The worst part was the running, the years of it, the life-shaped hole it had made. The petition for legal separation, Vivian said, will be filed next week. I know. I won't contest it. Whatever you need from me to make the process. Nathaniel, she turned to face him fully. I need you to not contest it. That's all. And I need you to do something with what you just told me. He looked at her. Not for me, she said. For whoever comes after this. For the version of yourself that can look at something valuable and choose to be present with it instead of managing it from a distance. She held his gaze, the gray eyes clear and direct and carrying none of the anger she had every right to still be holding. You're not a stupid man. You're not even a cruel one. Not at the core. You're a frightened one who made cruelty the armor. She paused. That's a choice you can stop making. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. She could see it landing. Not with the relief of absolution because she wasn't offering that, but with the harder, more demanding weight of being seen accurately by the one person who had reason to see you at your worst and was choosing to tell you the truth about yourself anyway. She left him in the garden with the frost and the hedgerows and the long work of becoming someone different than he had been. The legal separation was finalized 6 weeks later, in the quiet administrative language of a court document that reduced 11 months of a marriage to 4 clauses and 2 signatures. The royal court's review found substantial grounds. Vivienne walked out of the council offices on a Tuesday morning in early spring with the document in her leather folder and the specific, clean feeling of a door properly closed. Adrian was waiting outside. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his face doing what it did. Still, watchful, not performing anything. She came to stand beside him on the steps. The city moved below them in its daily rhythms, indifferent and continuous. Well, he said. Well, she said. They stood in the weak spring sunlight for a moment, not touching, not speaking. The kind of silence that doesn't require filling because it contains something rather than lacking it. The Foundation Charter, she said. I've been reviewing the draft. There's a structural issue in the Northern District allocation mechanism that I want to talk through. I read it yesterday. I made notes. Of course you did. The Harrow projections still have a stress point at year 3. I know. I'm addressing it. I thought you might want a second opinion. She turned to look at him. He was looking back with the same expression she had first read on his face at the royal banquet. Not pity, not strategy, just the uncomplicated attention of a man who had decided she was worth paying attention to and had never revised that decision regardless of what it cost him. I think, she said, that I'm done doing things alone that don't need to be done alone. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just the small, deep movement of a feeling that had been held carefully for a long time, finally being allowed to occupy its full space. That, he said, is the best thing you've said to me in 11 months of saying genuinely remarkable things." She almost smiled. Then she did smile, fully, the kind that reached her eyes and changed her face the way he had first seen it change at the West Haven Gala and had been thinking about ever since. "The Harrow projections," she said. "The Harrow projections," he agreed. They went to work. The Vivian Blackmore Foundation, registered under her maiden name, Ashford, which she reclaimed in the separation proceeding without ceremony or announcement, launched its first full operational cycle in the autumn of the same year. By the following spring, it had directly impacted resource allocation for 11 northern districts. By the year after that, Countess Marlowe had called it the most efficiently administered charitable organization in the kingdom's history, which was the kind of compliment that had practical consequences. Vivian ran it from a set of offices on the east side of the capital that were functional, well-lit, and decorated with nothing except a map of the territories they served, and on one wall, a small framed document that visitors sometimes asked about. It was the original notification from Council Chairman Aldwin confirming the proposal's passage through the spring committee review. 7 lines of formal administrative language. No ornamentation. She kept it not as a trophy, but as a record. Evidence that the distance between power and need was not fixed, that it could be moved. That moving it required a specific combination of things: preparation and patience, and the willingness to keep working when the ground was taken out from under you. And that these were not special gifts, but choices, made again and again, in the particular darkness of the moments when making them cost the most. Adrian, who had a desk in the foundation offices that he occupied on the days when his official duties permitted, and sometimes on the days when they didn't, had read the document once and said nothing about it, which was how she had known he understood. They did not rush what was between them. They let it grow at the pace of things that are real, rather than things that are performed, which was slower and less dramatic and considerably more durable. Nathaniel Blackmore, in the 2 years that followed the separation, did something that surprised the court more than anything else he had done. He began visiting the Northern Territories, not to inspect the lease operations, to talk to the tenant families. He hired a physician for permanent residency on the estate's western holdings. He reformed the lease agreement structure, removing the provisions that had made tenant investment in their own properties financially punitive. He did these things without announcing them and without seeking credit for them, which meant the court discussed them constantly, because powerful people doing the right thing without performance is the most disorienting spectacle available. He did not win Vivian back. He had known when she walked out of the East Garden that there was no version of winning her back available to him, and he had stopped wanting to win things at approximately the same time he started understanding what things were actually worth. Instead, he carried forward the only currency the moment had left him: the truth she had given him in a winter garden, stated without anger and without mercy, about what he could still choose to become. It turned out to be enough to build something on. Not what he had lost, something different, something built from the rubble of the man he'd been, which was slower and more deliberate and considerably less comfortable than anything he had constructed before, and which, in the specific way that things built from rubble sometimes are, turned out to be sturdier than the original. Years later, on a morning when the Northern Territories were finally beginning to show the cumulative effect of 3 years of consistent resource allocation, when the Harrow District yield figures came in above subsistence threshold for the first time in a decade, Vivian sat at her desk in the foundation offices and read the report with the same focused attention she gave everything. She reached the last page. Set it down. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do: moving, building, tearing down, rebuilding, all of it continuous and indifferent and alive with the specific energy of people who have decided, every morning, to keep going. She had decided that too. Every morning for 3 years, through documents and negotiations, and the particular fatigue of caring about things that were hard to change, she had decided. She picked up her pen and wrote across the top of the report, in the handwriting that had once composed a 3-sentence letter to a prince who told her she would need sides. Year 3. Harrow threshold met. Then she put the report in the folder where she kept the evidence of things that had been moved. Adrian knocked on the open door. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and the annotated census figures for the following year's allocation review, and he looked exactly the way he always looked. Like a man who had decided where he was supposed to be and had no unresolved feelings about it. The Harrow figures, he said. I know. Above threshold. I know. He set one of the cups on her desk. He sat down in the chair across from her and opened the census figures, and they began working through the numbers for the following year. And the city moved outside the window, and the morning light came in clear and flat across the map of the Northern Territories on the wall. And it was not the ending anyone would have written for her in the ballroom where it began. It was better. Because it was real. Because it had been built not from the grace of someone else's regard, but from the particular hard-won dignity of a woman who had been handed a diminished version of herself by someone afraid of her full size and had refused it, who had stood in the rubble of what she had expected her life to be and chosen, without self-pity and without ceremony, to build something true from what remained. That was the only philosophy she had ever needed. Not the language of survival or dominance, or the elaborate architectures powerful people construct to justify the distance they keep from consequences. Just the plain, unglamorous work of showing up, of being present to things that needed presence, of choosing, when the ground was taken out, to find new ground rather than standing in the space where the old ground had been, waiting for it to come back. It never came back. That was not a tragedy. That was how you found out what you were made of. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings are entirely imaginary and bear no resemblance to real individuals or events.